Making headlines for this week of December the 16th. Media unveiled. Western lies and its puppet media lay fully exposed for the world to see. Milking the corruption. Unofficial Brazilian president condemns citizens to 20 years of austerity. Banks jumping ship. Good news for Standing Rock as another bank seeks to withdraw from pipeline project. And Antarctic discovery. An ancient civilization may be the reason why high-profile people are suddenly interested in the icy continent.
With news around, upon, within, and beyond our planet, the program making disclosure official. This is Cosmic Vision News. Here is Jeffrey West.
Greetings and blessings to all. It is a relief to finally start seeing publicly what many have been talking about privately as far as the mainstream media corruption goes. The Western media has finally revealed themselves for the truly fake news organizations that they are. It's not only about their failure as far as the U.S. election goes. That was merely one nail in the coffin. However, they are now being exposed for their various agenda in numerous other situations, and right now the events in Syria are revealing just how bad these organizations have become. According to RT on December 13th, the fighting in eastern Aleppo has stopped and the Syrian government has regained control over the territory after the withdrawal of militants from the city was agreed. Russia's UN envoy Vitaly Churkin told the UN Security Council meeting in New York. The latest information that we have revealed during the past hour or so is that military operations in eastern Aleppo have concluded, Churkin said. So, there is no issue of any ceasefire or special humanitarian operations. The Syrian government has regained control of the eastern Aleppo, so the stage of practical humanitarian actions begins, he said. To be fair, RT did update this report stating that sporadic fighting between the Syrian army and the militants continued throughout the day, RIA Novosti reported, but as of late Tuesday, the sounds of heavy gunfire had largely lulled or become quiet. The problem is that no one seems to have informed the Western mainstream media, for it seems they have a different definition of sporadic fighting. CTV News in Canada reported on December 14th that the world held its breath as a ceasefire to evacuate rebel fighters and civilians from war-torn Aleppo briefly raised hopes for an end to the bloody conflict in Syria's largest city. Those hopes were dashed within hours as shelling and bombing resumed on Wednesday, according to CTV. Other Western headlines were saying very similar things, that the events were getting so bad and that it is Russia, Syria, and even Iran that are to blame for the alleged humanitarian crisis there. Again, no one seemed to tell the mainstream media anything, and their sources certainly were not on location. Several individual sources and one organization, RT, have been on location in Aleppo and are speaking to residents there. In the following report from RT, they look at numerous different Western sources, including CNN, BBC, France 24, Al Jazeera, and others.
The sound of fighting had eased in Aleppo by late Tuesday, bringing an unusually quiet night to the embattled Syrian city. RT's Lizzie Phelan, who spent months this year on the front lines in Syria, reports it was, quote, the quietest night in Aleppo that she has experienced to date. And the calm comes in the wake of numerous Syrian army victories against militants in Aleppo. And the vast majority of the city has now been liberated. Meanwhile, the evacuation of civilians from the conflict zone continues. Almost 6,000 people with 2,000 children so far have escaped the violence in the past 24 hours. But while over 100,000 civilians have safely left, so too have numerous militants. Meantime, the dangerous work has begun of removing the many booby traps left behind by extremists across the city. However, commenting on the campaign to liberate Aleppo, Russia's envoy to the UN warns the war is far from over.
To say that the Syrian conflict is close to being over would be an exaggeration. There is still a long road ahead, but we would prefer this road to follow the plan that was set out in a resolution that calls for a new constitution to be adopted for Syria.
Our Washington correspondent Guyane Chichikan went to the U.S. State Department to get a reaction on the latest victory celebrations in Aleppo.
The State Department has a pretty one-dimensional view of what's happening in eastern Aleppo. Its spokesman John Kirby confirmed it today when asked if he saw reports of people cheering in eastern Aleppo as the Syrian government was retaking control of that part of the city.
No, there are all these reports about atrocities and so on, and I'm not in any way questioning their possible credibility. But also, I saw other reports where people are jubilant, they're happy to see the army command, they're going to the western side where they can get, medicine and food and so on and all these things. So it is not all just one dimension, kind of. Would you agree with that?
No, I don't, Saeed. I mean, I haven't seen every picture coming out of Aleppo, but I haven't seen, honestly, Saeed, I haven't seen any dancing in the streets.
Many people who are coming out of the war-torn eastern Aleppo are telling stories that contradict the State Department's view of the situation there, and apparently John Kirby never heard those stories from his sources of information.
We gather the best information that we can from a variety of sources. Some of it's press reporting, no question. A lot of it comes from reputable aid agencies that are either on the ground or have associates on the ground in Syria. And some of it comes from intelligence sources, which I'm obviously clearly not going to get into. And I don't think that it's incumbent upon me or anybody else from a podium to sit there in detail and provide a laundry list of every single individual organization that gives us information. It's a mosaic. And frankly, again, I would encourage you to go flip on CNN today and look for yourself at the imagery that's coming out of Aleppo by a reputable news organization.
We have followed Mr. Kirby's advice and looked into coverage of Aleppo by respected Western media outlets, and various questions were raised, as Murad Gazdiev reports.
What's happening in Aleppo is one thing. What the media is telling you is happening is entirely another.
100,000 people are trapped in the city. We're getting reports of executions, of very grim pictures emerging from inside Aleppo.
Tens of thousands of civilians are still trapped in the ever-shrinking rebel enclave.
Complete meltdown on humanity.
Of just how trapped these civilians are in Aleppo. If they stay at home, they could be killed.
Tens of thousands of people remain besieged, trapped in the war zone.
And the source is, well, someone told them. That's it. Very little of what you see in the Western media about Aleppo is verified. After all, they've got no one on the ground. What they do have are exaggerated headlines.
Who's doing these killings? I can't say who's done all of them, but we understand at least one Iraqi militia is involved. We've heard of killings of civilians in this way in 4 different locations, so it may well be different forces involved.
Now, the UN is being much more careful, unlike some. Just look at this. They appear to be saying there are 100,000 civilians packed into 3 square kilometers. That would have made the part of Aleppo still held by rebels the most densely populated area on the planet. Do you buy that?
This, thus far, is still a war of media. It's a propaganda war. I mean, this is an example, and it exemplifies the level of media reporting and fake news and misinformation on Syria.
And it's not just on TV. Online, you'll find hundreds of heart-wrenching images allegedly taken in Aleppo, except many weren't. This picture, for example, was taken from a music video and sold as an image of what's happening in Aleppo. Then you have this, Assad burning children, even as he guarantees safe passage to rebels and civilians who wish to leave. It's been 4 long years for Aleppo. The shelling, shooting and killing lasted for 1,609 days. Now, it's all but over. But if you listen to the mainstream media, well, That's a bad thing. Morad Gazdiev, RT.
Yet, there are video reports of people dancing in the streets, and one link will be in the show's summary. RT invited 3 different people to participate in a discussion that became quite brutal at times. Brent Budowski, a columnist representing The Hill news publication, freelance researcher and journalist Vanessa Beeley, and Daniel McAdams from the Ron Paul Institute. Budowski's agenda is extremely clear right from the beginning, although RT was allowing it. From the 40-minute interview, here's a sample of what was said by each. The first comment from Budowski, the second from Beeley, and the third from McAdams, with a follow-up from Beeley.
Well, nobody wants to kill and defeat the terrorists more than I do and more than the United States. But what is happening right now in Aleppo is a moral crime against humanity. I agree with what Secretary of State John Kerry said, that the Russian government should do everything to stop it, to end it, to support a ceasefire, to end the carnage and the killing and the misery and the bombing of innocent civilians. The United Nations is concerned about it, and I agree with their investigation about possible war crimes. I agree with what the pictures tell us in plain English. The bombing of civilians and the massacre of the innocents must stop. My strong advice to President Putin would be to follow John Kerry's advice and put an end to that carnage and killing right now. So should Assad. So should the Syrian army. It's a joke to treat them as liberators and decency. They are mass murdering civilians. And I would add the Iranians, who are allies in the killing of innocent people. This is a crime against humanity, and the whole world is watching. And there's going to be more serious talk every hour of every day about war crimes. And I agree with the Secretary of State of the United States, who wants it ended now. He is totally right.
Well, actually, I've just returned from 3 days in East Aleppo, and I would like to 100% correct the lies that are being disseminated by media, think tanks, governments across the West, particularly your guest who's just uttered complete lies. I've spent basically 3 days in all the various liberated areas of East Aleppo, including Hanano, including the Old City, and including today. I went to Jibrin, which is the area where they are receiving the escaped civilians, to basically register them, to give them some form of medical treatment. Many of the testimonies that we received from the civilians that this gentleman has just accused Russia and Syria of bombing actually told us that they had been incarcerated for the last 4 years by the United States-backed various terrorist militant groups, such as Nusra Front, Ara al-Sham, Nour al-Din Zinki, who we know beheaded the 12-year-old Palestinian child, Abdullah Isa. We were told of stories of civilians who were trying to leave this imprisonment when the Russian and Syrian governments opened the humanitarian corridors. I interviewed one lady, I have her on film, where she tells me that one woman who had been kept under a condition of starvation and malnutrition by these militant factions, who were stockpiling any humanitarian aid.
Can I ask one quick question?
And either selling...
Can I ask one quick question, please?
No, could you just let me finish, please? Could you just let me finish? They were stockpiling the food, selling it at extortionate prices. When this lady went on her knees to beg for food, she was shot in the mouth by the militant factions that have been imprisoning these civilians for the last 4.5 years, and that your media and your propaganda has supported that incarceration, torture, abuse, and absolute horror that these civilians have had to go through.
Now, this is a good example of what's wrong with the mainstream media. You have a mainstream media source like Brent Budowski, who goes on television telling us, you've got to believe the government, you've got to believe the U.S. government. This is the same mainstream media that lied through its teeth about Iraq, that lied through its teeth about Benghazi, about the slaughters going on there that were not going on, who are lying through their teeth right now. There are no foreign media sources in East Aleppo right now. They are not on the ground. They are all using information that they are getting through rebel sources. That is the truth. So, Budowski, what you're doing right now is you're putting out fake news, and you know it because there are no sources on the ground. You're saying just believe the U.S. government. You're supposed to be in the media. You're supposed to be doing independent work.
Where are these sources being able to transmit this information from? Because in East Aleppo, there is no 3G, there is no Wi-Fi, there is no electricity. So I'd like to know how these sources are able to get this information via Skype connection to organizations, I'll use that term loosely, like CNN, BBC, Channel 4. I would like very much to know how they achieve it and how they're able to do that in East Aleppo. As I said, unlike the mainstream corporate media, I have been in East Aleppo for the last 3 days. Therefore, I'm giving you eyewitness testimony, unlike your mainstream media that has not been there and relies upon spurious activists to give them the information, like the White Helmets.
Is not on the ground there.
Like the White Helmets, who
the UN is not on the ground there.
Like the White Helmets, who are funded by every single nation that has a vested and declared interest in regime change in Syria. That is your reliable source.
The summary has the video of the full and very lively conversation. CNN and other media, including The Journal in Ireland, aired the statement made by U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Samantha Power, attempting to sell the United Nations on how Aleppo will be remembered, while also attempting to blame Syria, Russia, Iran, and their allies for the alleged crimes in Syria. What it also shows, reading between the lines, is just how scared the U.S. and Western power is becoming at being exposed themselves as being responsible.
Aleppo will join the ranks of those events in world history that define modern evil, that stain our conscience decades later. Halabja, Rwanda, Srebrenica, and now Aleppo. To the Assad regime, Russia and Iran, your forces and proxies are carrying out these crimes. Your barrel bombs and mortars and airstrikes have allowed the militia in Aleppo to encircle tens of thousands of civilians in your ever-tightening noose. It is your noose. 3 member states of the UN contributing to a noose around civilians. It should shame you. Instead, by all appearances, it is emboldening you. You are plotting your next assault. Are you truly incapable of shame? Is there literally nothing that can shame you? Is there no act of barbarism against civilians, no execution of a child that gets under your skin, that just creeps you out a little bit? Is there nothing you will not lie about or justify? To the members of this Council and all member states of the United Nations, know that the ghastly tactics we are witnessing in Aleppo will not stop if the city falls. The regime and its Russian allies will only be emboldened to replicate their starve and surrender and slaughter tactics elsewhere.
Yet, thankfully, even she is being publicly humiliated, with other reports coming directly out of Aleppo. Lizzie Phelan, reporting directly to RT from Aleppo, filed this report about alleged attacks upon buses that are transporting the surrendered militants out of the area.
Claims that pro-Assad forces shot at evacuees have also been denied by Aleppo locals. Well, right now we can cross live to our correspondent, Lizzie Phelan, who's on the ground for us. And let's see if she can bring us up to speed. Lizzie, hello there. Tell us what's been going on.
Well, we've just seen the first buses, presumably filled with some of Aleppo's last rebels, leaving the city on the roads east to the province of Idlib, which has already received thousands of militants who have surrendered in other parts of Syria, particularly from the province of Damascus. Some of them, we're told, will be heading yet further east across the border into Turkey. And this evacuation deal has been reached as a result of negotiations with the Russian Center for Reconciliation and the Syrian army, but it did take quite some time. There was a lot of stalling this morning for those buses to cross the frontier into opposition territory to evacuate people. The Syrian government wanted to negotiate a better deal to include the evacuation of injured civilians and prisoners from the villages of Fua and Kafrea, which are still under rebel siege in the province of Idlib. Now, we're told that there's around 15,000 people due to be evacuated or remaining in that now no longer last rebel-held pocket of Aleppo. Of those 15,000, 4,000 are rebels, the remainder are the families of rebels and civilians that didn't evacuate over the last few weeks. Now, the Syrian army has said that they guarantee the safe passage of these evacuees out of Aleppo. The process is being monitored by the Russian Center for Reconciliation, their drones and their cameras. Nevertheless, as you mentioned, there have been these allegations this morning of the Syrian army attacking civilians as they leave on those buses. But we've been speaking to locals and local journalists who have been here since the crack of dawn, and they say that those first buses entered into opposition territory to collect the evacuees long after these allegations emerged, and they say they heard no sound of gunfire or shooting in the area. And the source of most of these allegations that we've seen online picked up by the mainstream media is the white helmets, or the Syrian civil defense, which is often cited in Western media's reporting on what's happening in rebel-held territory in Syria. But I wanted to find out more about who the white helmets really are. So yesterday I spoke to many civilians who just fled East Aleppo, and the picture that they portrayed about the white helmets was very different from that which we've seen in our media.
At this time, it appears that not only are Western sources and leaders lying about the facts, but they are also basing their reports on information that had not even taken place, as Phelan reported, stating that the reports of alleged attacks took place on buses even before the buses had arrived to transport militant rebels who had surrendered out of the territory. The sources that Western outlets are relying on for information are those outlets connected to governments and organizations that have a vested interest in regime change in Syria. Another independent researcher and journalist we heard moments ago, Vanessa Beeley, was in Aleppo in October and shared more on the white helmets with RT on October 19th.
There is confusion over the white helmets, who's backing them, what they're about, what their actual motives are. Can you shed any light on them?
Absolutely. I mean, you've mentioned the fact that they are a multi-million funded organization, not a non-governmental organization. They're multi-million funded by various nations, NATO states that have a declared vested interest in Syria, in regime change in Syria. This is very important, a very important point to make. And we've seen this so-called humanitarian organization calling for a no-fly zone on various occasions, various false flags, including the very recent alleged attack on a humanitarian convoy by Russia, which has been completely discredited since. Of course, that story was broken again by the White Helmets. We also see them now being entertained in France by, top government officials like Manuel Valls, Prime Minister. He has been speaking them today, and France's involvement in Syria has been very clear from the beginning, right from 2008, when Sarkozy was furious that Assad refused the Qatari pipeline, and certainly refused France's suggestion that 70% of the revenue from that pipeline should come to France and 30% to Syria. According to some reports. And so, again, we're seeing very clearly France's vested interest. We know that France has invested heavily in the propaganda units inside East Aleppo, like Aleppo Media Center, that is heavily funded by the CFI, the Canal France International, which is French Foreign Office funded. When we hear Manuel Valls speaking to the White Helmet operatives, we hear him saying things like, the battle for Aleppo is our battle, it's France's battle. Well, I think somebody should remind Manuel Valls that Syria is no longer a French colony. It hasn't been since 1959, and actually the battle for Syria is for the Syrian people. It's not for France. And so I don't think the White Helmets can declare themselves independent and impartial and humanitarian when they are being wined and dined by a nation that has a very clear and a publicly declared interest in regime change in Syria.
Eva Bartlett, a Canadian independent journalist who has also spent much time on the ground in Syria, spoke at a UN press conference on Syria on December the 9th, and she was challenged by a Norwegian journalist of the Western media on information coming out of the country and why the Western media would lie about it. We start first with the question from the journalist.
you talk about the corporate media, the Western media, the lies, and all of this. Could you explain what you think might be the agenda from us in the Western media, and why we should lie, why the international organizations on the ground should lie, why we shouldn't believe all these absolutely documentable facts that we see from the ground, these hospitals being bombed, these civilians who are talking about the atrocities that they have been experiencing. How can you justify calling all of us liars?
Sure. There are certainly honest journalists amongst the very compromised establishment media. International organizations on the ground. Tell me which ones are on the ground in eastern Aleppo. Yeah, okay, I'll tell you, there are none. These organizations are relying on the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which is based in Coventry, UK, and which is one man. They're relying on compromised groups like the White Helmets, which let's talk about the White Helmets. The White Helmets were founded in 2013 by a British ex-military officer. They have been funded to the tune of $100 million by the US, UK, and Europe and other states. They purport to be rescuing civilians in eastern Aleppo and Idlib, yet no one in eastern Aleppo has heard of them. And I say no one, bearing in mind that now 95% of these areas of eastern Aleppo are liberated. The White Helmets purport to be neutral, yet they can be found carrying guns and standing on the dead bodies of Syrian soldiers. And their video footage actually contains children that have been recycled in different reports. So you can find a girl named Aya who turns up in a report in month, say, August, and she turns up in the next month in 2 different locations. So they are not credible. The SOHR is not credible. Unnamed activists are not credible. Once or twice maybe, but every time, not credible. So your sources on the ground, you don't have them. As for your agenda, not your, but the agenda of some corporate media, it is the agenda of regime change. How can the New York Times, I was reading it this morning, or how can Democracy Now!, which I was reading the other day, maintain until this day that this is a civil war in Syria? How can they maintain until this day that that the protests were unarmed and nonviolent until, say, 2012? That is absolutely not true. How can they maintain that the Syrian government is attacking civilians in Aleppo when every person that's coming out of these areas occupied by terrorists is saying the opposite?
The Norwegian journalist was rightfully put into his place by Bartlett, as he was unable to name any official organization in the region that he claimed was providing so-called credible information. Bartlett was brilliantly prepared with all the necessary information to discredit the White Hats. Former U.S. Ambassador Peter Galbraith also seems to disagree on Western claims that alleged atrocities are continuing.
The real question now is what happens, because regardless of the rights or wrongs of those who oppose the President Assad, it's clear that he has won this war, and so that the important thing now is to try to figure out ways to bring the fighting to an end without more of the kind of tactics that have taken place in eastern Aleppo. There's no point in continuing a war once it's already been lost.
Syrian President Bashar al-Assad responded to the Western allegations against him in an interview with RT on December 14th. In the interview, Assad states that all so-called Western aid that has allegedly been going to Syria has been going instead to fund the rebel forces to fight Assad and have not been going to civilians at all. The link to the full interview will be in the show summary, as will links to all other videos and supporting information for this story. The fact that the corporate media has been a tool for the brainwashing of the Western world is becoming much harder to dispute. The history of this, however, goes back a long way to a CIA campaign known as Operation Mockingbird. Due to the length of this story, I am choosing to leave out this particular video from the newscast. However, the video about Operation Mockingbird will be posted in the show summary for those wishing to view it. As it stands at the moment, RT is the only organization with a film crew inside Aleppo and documenting events unfolding there. The Western media is not using this information. RT has been giving a voice to at least 2 independent journalists, Eva Bartlett and Vanessa Beeley, who have also been on the ground in the area and documenting events. The Western media has not. Someone should perhaps ask Samantha Power if she is the one who has no shame. While the West attempts to market a message that a genocide continues, reports on the ground show a population receiving help from Syria, Russia, and those allies, while having only contempt for the Western-funded rebels who have torn their city apart in a Western attempt to destabilize Syria for regime change. The residents are dancing in the streets, and there is more gratitude to non-Western forces than there is to the West itself. In a late addition to this story leading up to airtime, a video has been posted attempting to explain what appears to be the sudden and coordinated effort to send out what are being called final messages to the world in an attempt to drum up support for the Western version of the story in Syria. Anissa Nouai of In the Now shares the following video.
Final messages are flying out of Aleppo, Syria. They're taking social media by storm simultaneously. It almost looks like a coordinated PR campaign.
No place now to go. It's the last place.
This may be my last video.
This might be close to, if not the last communication.
It's the last time that I talked to you.
It's almost as if they were hoping these final messages would trend and get picked up by mainstream media.
Bombs are everywhere. People are running. They don't know where. Just running.
We are here living a genocide, literally.
People are executed. It's as simple as that.
It's almost like these are just innocent civilians with no message, no strategy, no politics, just people simply fighting for their lives. One day, saying goodbye to the world on social media. The next day, giving interviews to BBC, CNN, and Al Jazeera, all in prime time. Well, they're not. These are activists. Some of them just recently joined Twitter and clearly support the revolution. They have thousands of followers. Some call themselves journalists and are verified on Facebook, like Bilal Abdul Karim, an American who has no problem pushing al-Nusra propaganda. You know, the rebel. This guy is a member of the White Helmets, who were founded by a British ex-military officer and have been funded with millions by the US and UK. And then there's a little girl named Bana, also joined Twitter not so long ago, in September. She's already verified and has over 200,000 followers. Bana is 7 years old and tweets in perfect English from the heart of East Aleppo with a little help from her mommy. She, of course, also had a final message just in time. So what do all of these people have in common? They want you to think there's one side to this story, one truth, that Assad is randomly going from city to city and killing his own people for some crazy reason with the help of Russia, even though the whole world is watching every step. They want you to think that these civilians pouring out of Aleppo are running from genocide committed by the Syrian army, and those who celebrate on the streets are dancing on children's graves, while Al-Qaeda-infiltrated rebels are bravely and heroically defending civilians in East Aleppo. The question is, do you buy it? Because millions of people do.
Thankfully, people are teaching themselves now what to look for as soon as something appears on social media, and they are using their skills to catch the cabal efforts as they attempt their fear-mongering campaigns, while their so-called final messengers suddenly gain attention days after on the mainstream media. But in this scenario, we have to go back to what Vanessa Beeley was asking before. How can these so-called final messages be transmitted out of Aleppo, where there is no 3G, no electricity, and no Wi-Fi? It becomes very obvious that the messages have been mass-produced in areas where there is electricity and an internet. And it certainly is not in Aleppo. In other geopolitical news, in Brazil, the political mess there appears to be escalating. CVN has reported previously on how former President Dilma Rousseff was unceremoniously removed from power in a coup shortly before the Olympics that were held in that country earlier this year. In May, the London Guardian reported that Brazil's suspended President Rousseff condemns the impeachment as a coup. In a separate article, The Guardian added that Michel Temer has unveiled an all-male, conspicuously white cabinet to run one of the world's most ethnically diverse nations, as he promised to restore confidence in Latin America's biggest economy. At that time, he was quoted in the article as saying the following: "Trust me, trust the values of our people and our ability to recuperate the economy." It would seem pretty clear that he was not referring to the general population of Brazil and that he was directing his message only to those corrupt individuals who needed protection from the anti-corruption measures being put forth by the former government of Rousseff. Sputnik News had reported that a month later, Brazilians began to revolt as the new leader immediately began to impose austerity cuts upon the people. Later in July, a court in Brazil had investigated. Sputnik News reported in early July that a report by independent auditors on behalf of Brazil's Senate indicates that the impeachment effort against democratically elected Brazilian President Rousseff is without basis, nearly 2 months after the official was suspended from office for 180 days pending a final vote by legislators. The Senate's expert report concluded that there was no indication of direct or indirect action by Rousseff to engage in such budgetary malfeasance. Fast forward to present day, 6 months later, the country is still caught up in corruptive scandal. In an interview with the Real News Network, journalist Shoban Saxena shares that leaders that carried out the legislative coup against Rousseff are embroiled in corruption scandals themselves, and they are systematically destroying political institutions and social progress in Brazil. Saxena's interview with TRNN will appear in the show summary, but will be left out of the newscast this week. Also in the show summary, but being left out this week, is another TRNN interview with Alfredo Saad Filho, a professor at London's School of African and Oriental Studies. He comments on Temer's constitutional amendments of December 15th, imposing another 20 years of harsh austerity cuts upon the Brazilian population, most of whom are against the cuts and against him for his illegitimate coup against Rousseff. According to Saad Filho, Rousseff was ousted to shift economic policy towards neoliberalism, and now Temer is rewarding the banks and financial investors for backing the legislative coup. One also has to keep in mind the bigger picture of this story. At least one of the pieces of this bigger picture is connected to attempts by the international cabal interests to put a break in what they believe is one of the weakest links of the strengthening BRICS alliance. Indirectly, it was meant to deal another blow to the global strategy of BRICS, of China, and of Russia to shut down global control of the criminal fiat fractional reserve banking system and also the commercial system of admiralty law. Among the latest from Standing Rock, there are several good pieces of news, but there's also some unfortunate news, and I will start with this news first. The very reason why the water protectors are at Standing Rock became even more evident this past week. Tom DeChristopher of CNBC reported via NBC News on December 12th that a pipeline leak has spilled tens of thousands of gallons of crude oil into a North Dakota creek roughly 2.5 hours from Cannonball, where water protectors are camped out in opposition to the Dakota pipeline. North Dakota officials estimated more than 176,000 gallons of crude oil leaked from the Belle Fourche pipeline into the Ash Coulee Creek. A spokeswoman for the company that operates the pipeline reported that the spill was contained quickly, but she could not explain why electronic sensors had failed to detect and report the leak. On the more important positive side, however, there was one other good news story that I forgot to include in last week's newscast. There are also a few other positive developments this week as well. A story carried on the local news that does not appear to have been picked up nationally or internationally is a story about kindness demonstrated by the Indigenous Youth Council, not to those water protectors at Standing Rock, but rather to the police force.
While the pipeline protests have been contentious and even dangerous at times, a group of young demonstrators is trying to de-escalate the tension. Max Grossfeld is here to tell us about the gesture they made. Max?
Several weeks ago, law enforcement dealing with the Dakota Access Pipeline protest sent out a list of goods they could use if the community would like to donate them. The International Indigenous Youth Council saw that list and decided to use it as an opportunity for de-escalation. Led by the council, demonstrators dropped off Gatorade, water, batteries, breakfast bars, and more. The teens said they wanted to let police know they have compassion for all people and all walks of life.
As American citizens, as good American citizens that we are, we went ahead and we supplied them with that. We gave them water because water is life.
We reached out to the Morton County Sheriff's Department, who declined to comment on camera. Instead, they directed us to a Facebook post that read, quote, "Thank you to the members of the International Indigenous Youth Council. Your kindness and support is very much appreciated."
It is perhaps not surprising that they declined to comment publicly, as it might risk putting them into an even deeper position of having to be held accountable for their actions at Standing Rock. Pipelines, of course, depend upon massive funding, usually coming from financial institutions. Thanks to the actions of Norway's Northern Sami indigenous group, their presentation of an environmental assessment report to the Norwegian government led to the decision of both the National Bank DNB and Norway's Odin Fund Management to scale back their respective commitments to the project. Now, a Swedish bank is being reported as having second thoughts on the project. An article on the whitewolfpack.com website reported on December 14th that after a visit by its representatives to Standing Rock, Swedish financial institution Nordea announced today that it will not back the Dakota Access Pipeline. Nordea met with tribal representatives on the ground, including Standing Rock Sioux Tribe Chairman David Archambault II. The Standing Rock Sioux Tribe urged Nordea to divest and respect the rights of indigenous communities via a letter delivered by Sami artist and activist Sofia Janok. It was announced that Nordea will demand guarantees from the companies building the Dakota Access Pipeline that it will not go through the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe's reservation land. If the companies do not respect this, Nordea will start the process of selling its holdings in the companies. In a statement issued by the bank, they stated the following: "It's an important step that Nordea put its foot down and now has specific requirements that the oil pipeline not go through the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe's land." Greenpeace Nordic climate and energy campaigner Rolf Lindahl said, "It sends a clear signal to the world that the rights of indigenous people must be respected. We encourage others to set the same demands for the companies that are building the oil pipeline." The fact that bank after bank are withdrawing or voicing concern over the project shows the power of people united. This is another positive development for water protectors, though it does not yet determine the pipeline's future, which should be stopped in its entirety. In a separate story, Frank Hopper, reporting for the Indian Country Media Network, reported on December 13th that for months, supporters of the Standing Rock Sioux have been urged to boycott Wells Fargo, the world's second largest bank, because of its financing of the pipeline. Many closed their Wells Fargo checking and savings accounts, moving the money to credit unions. The amounts weren't much, perhaps a few hundred or a few $1,000s each. One supporter, however, represented a bit more, about $3 billion. On Monday, December 12th, the Seattle City Council introduced legislation that would effectively sever the city's relationship with Wells Fargo. The bank currently manages the city's $3 billion operating account, which includes the $30 million biweekly employee payroll. The contract runs out in a year's time. It would have to be observed closely next year whether the city actually delivers on that promise or whether it was just a good public relations stunt for the present time. It can no longer be denied, however, that people are becoming informed and that their informed position is now forcing companies and even governments to consider their actions a little bit more closely before just blindly jumping into any investment projects that are damaging to humanity and the planet. As I am not subscribed to the Wall Street Journal, I was unable to read their article covering the release of a report by the Environmental Protection Agency that has, no surprise, determined that fracking can taint drinking water. Sadly, however, it appears that the report did not go far enough. Fox News Health covered the story, and they reported that fracking can affect drinking water supplies in certain circumstances, the Obama administration said in a long-awaited report issued Tuesday, leaving open the possibility of more widespread impacts that it says can't be determined with current data. The report, written by the Environmental Protection Agency scientists, includes findings that are more open-ended than those in a draft version last year when the agency said fracking, or hydraulic fracturing, isn't having widespread systematic impacts on drinking water. In Canada, meanwhile, reactions continue across the land, with people realizing more and more that Prime Minister Trudeau is not wholly intending to honor his so-called new relationship with Canada's Indigenous peoples. At a recent event, a young Indigenous woman, 12-year-old Autumn Pelletier, was not given the chance to deliver a speech at a gathering attended by the Prime Minister. In a brief interaction with him, according to a Huffington Post article, Pelletier described meeting him and telling him how disappointed she was in his choices to support pipelines. Trudeau allegedly promised to take care of the water. No mention there about humanity in general and our planet's survival overall. In financial news, perhaps it should not be a surprise that the West is ramping up its campaign against Russia, China, and the Eastern aligning countries. According to a Sputnik News article on December 16th, China will pursue a multilateral trade deal that intentionally excludes the United States, U.S. Secretary of Commerce Penny Pritzker said at a Center for Strategic and International Studies forum in Washington. This would very much represent a threat to the cabal establishment and would deal another blow to its hegemonic agenda. Now, it is worth noting that this is coming from someone based at a think tank in Washington, and therefore some discernment is required. Keep in mind that the U.S. is trying to find a reason to justify military action against China in the South China Sea, and this could be part of yet another covert strategy to justify military actions. Pritzker claimed to be quoting someone from China in saying that we're going to pursue a multilateral trade agreement, and the purpose is we're going to keep the United States out. Pritzker's response to this was that this is not good for American workers, this is not good for the American economy, and this is not good for American power. It might also explain why you heard the comments you did coming from Budowski earlier in the newscast about needing to believe the U.S. government and the UN. The statements could also be veiled attempts to scare up more support for a failing Trans-Pacific Partnership deal in an attempt to get the world trapped into a corporate commercial agreement before it is too late and the cabal loses even more power than they are already losing. Assuming there is truth to the article, however, and in fact there is evidence to suggest that there is, as CVN reported some time ago, it shows how countries in the East are doing their own trade agreements without using the US dollar as the median currency of exchange. What this means is that the global cabal is no longer able to skim money off for their criminal and black budget projects on the foreign exchange, involving international trade that does not include the U.S. It does not represent a threat to the U.S. generally. What it represents is a threat to those who have been profiting illegally from foreign exchange and using that profit to fund criminal activities that have kept the world in debt, in fear, and enslaved to criminal systems of banking and commercial law. This week, we continue with the series relating to the history of the Exchange Stabilization Fund. In what may be a case of synchronistic timing, this week's segment of the history goes into the media propaganda and how the process of education became corrupted to communicate a particular economic agenda. As I listen to these reports, it moves along in a rather difficult pace, and this may be harder for those whose first language is not English. I do apologize for this. This segment starts by referencing scandals and how people dig themselves deeper and deeper into them. The segment goes into John F. Kennedy's attempts to introduce a new financial system and how the U.S. dug itself out of crisis, or at least one crisis, by going further into debt.
Most scandals start small, and the perpetrators dig themselves deeper and deeper. The ESF had no hope of ever replacing the enormous quantity of money it had spent. But instead of facing this harsh reality, it tried to delay the day of reckoning. The ESF's desperate dollar defense. The steady drain on U.S. gold holdings was a threat to the ESF, because if it led to dollar devaluation and economic depression, the entire world would have focused on the confidential accounts of the Exchange Stabilization Fund and the activity it was financing. This also meant defending the Bretton Woods Agreement, because any major reform of the Bretton Woods system, especially the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, would have also exposed the ESF's activities. The ESF needed to do whatever it took to defend the world's monetary system, and the American dollar had to be propped up, even at the cost of begging. This is how the dollar's defense began. Currency interventions to prop up the dollar. In 1961, the ESF began intervening in the foreign exchange market. However, there were some problems. By 1962, the ESF had committed much of its resources through the provision of foreign aid, wasting them funding covert operations. The IMF was also drained of most of its gold and dollars. Remember that the ESF's desperate dollar defense is to hide this fact to begin with. Anyhow, the Federal Reserve System's resources were quickly recruited to supplement the dollar's defense, and the Fed gave up whatever was left of its independence without much of a fight. Unfortunately for the ESF, it had another problem. The way central banks defend their currencies is by selling off their foreign reserves, and the ESF did not have any foreign currencies on hand, so the Treasury used a variety of strategies to come up with the foreign currencies it needed. It got West Germany to prepay its World War II debt. The Treasury also borrowed to get the money it needed, using a series of special Treasury bond sales to foreign governments. These were called Rosa bonds. They were denominated in foreign currencies and were part of America's national debt. The ESF also entered into a network of swap agreements with other central banks. Currency swaps are a derivative instrument that allow irresponsible central banks to temporarily prop up their currencies by racking up large amounts of foreign debt. The ESF used these swaps because they hid what it was doing. For example, it doesn't look like the US is borrowing anything here, does it? Still another way the ESF got foreign currencies was by using the IMF. The IMF was a great help in defending the dollar. However, explaining how these IMF loans work is complicated, but it adds up to this: more foreign-denominated debt hidden from the American people. Through all these different types of arrangements, the United States armed itself with the hundreds of billions of dollars worth of major foreign currencies it needed to defend the dollar, gambling in derivative markets. Because so much of its resources were tied up, the ESF intervened mainly in the forwards market. Despite all its stratagems to come up with foreign currencies, the Treasury simply didn't have enough to defend the dollar, so it sold foreign currencies it didn't yet have through forward transactions. By promising to sell these currencies in the future, the Treasury encouraged individuals to hold dollar-denominated assets. When the dollar for future delivery sells at a substantial discount, it implies that holders have doubts about its value, and weakness in the dollar may induce foreigners to move their money elsewhere. So every time a foreign currency traded at a premium to the dollar, the ESF entered into millions worth of forward contracts. All these forward commitments carried the risk of loss if the dollar did not appreciate. For example, when the Treasury was selling all these forward marks, it was gambling that the price of the mark would drift lower, and the ESF eventually lost big time on its forward bets. Forwards are also a type of derivative, the same complicated financial bets that have fueled the mess over the last few years. And 50 years ago, long before Wall Street even knew what they were, the ESF was dealing in massive quantities of these risky bets. The London Gold Pool, another arrangement made to bolster the world's monetary system against collapse, was the London Gold Pool. Formed in late 1961, it was a device to halt the raids on gold and give the dollar the appearance of strength. The exchange same stabilization fund was used to participate in the gold pool, and the U.S. supplied 59% of the gold sold in London. The United States never officially acknowledged taking part in this pool. However, this very real international gold pool kept the London free market stable temporarily during the 60s. So the ESF has a history of international conspiracy, deceiving the world. This Wall Street Journal article shows the ESF's attitude towards the truth. In this business, you have to choose between lying to people or scaring them to death. The ESF's choice is clear: to lie. This lying is squarely in the public interest. To give the world a glimpse at the raw figures for a single day's actual gold outflow could prove disastrous. Debasing statistics. The ESF is ever more shrewdly guarding the dollar's value abroad through little-known techniques that range from double-counting gold bars to tinkering with the maturities of otherwise routine government securities. The result is a web of statistics that mask almost as much as they display. Even a prominent financier who helped create the government's dollar defenses confesses that he can't tell anymore what our balance of payment trend is. The ESF had arrangements with the IMF that made the gold stock look healthier than it really was. Only a fleeting footnote brought the ESF's double counting of gold bars to light. For ESF officials anxious to put the best face on figures, nothing is too absurd, including selling government debt with the odd maturity of 1 year and 2 days. This dishonesty was centered in the Treasury at the ESF. Even the massive currency swaps the Fed has with other central banks are carefully constructed to avoid statistical injuries. Since the 1960s, the dodges have only become more artful.
What if it's true, as Kevin Phillips recently stated in an article in Harper's, that ever since the 1960s, Washington has gulled its citizens and creditors by debasing official statistics, the vital instruments with which the vigor and muscle of the American economy are measured?
Propaganda. Statistical nonsense was only the beginning. In defense of the dollar, the ESF unleashed the mighty Wurlitzer. Every propaganda pitch was used to promote confidence in the dollar. Whenever the value of the dollar came under question, this propaganda took over to convince us that losing money is good for us. It was in the 60s that the ESF's favorite bit of propaganda was born: the danger of deflation. Americans were told to worry less about the outflow of U.S. gold and instead worry about worldwide deflation. This was pure ESF propaganda. Deflation signifies a general decline in prices, and it hasn't happened in the United States since the ESF's creation. So right when the ESF was in the middle of this desperate dollar defense, there was a flood of articles like these, warning that the dollar might magically go up in value. Two things have happened since the 1960s. The dollar has lost nearly all its value, and the articles warning about deflation have gotten louder and louder in volume. Today we've reached a point where every Wall Street economist is looking for the arrival of a great deflation. Two things to take away from this are: 1. The loudness of the deflation propaganda gives a good idea of the ESF's level of control over U.S. media. 2. As long as the ESF is in charge of defending the dollar, the chance of any real deflation is nil. Corrupting economics. Classic economics teaches that government deficit spending leads to inflation. This was the dominant view before the 1960s. Heavy deficits made for inflation. Heavy government spending ruins the dollar. This fundamental truth was acknowledged by everyone, and it was a threat to the ESF. You see, in the 60s, when the ESF was spreading deflation propaganda and doing everything in its power to boost confidence in the dollar, articles like this one appeared in the press. If we are safe in all this spending, what are we waiting for? Why don't we double the national debt and everyone gets rich? Anyone can promise to speed up the printing presses. Does this bring happiness and security? We all grow progressively poorer as the dollar's value declines, and declining currencies follow the law of physical bodies. They accelerate as they fall. It should be obvious why the U.S. Treasury did not like classic economics. As part of its dollar defense, the ESF used its network of American academics to promote a new set of rules for managing the economy. This new theory of fiscal management called for planned treasury deficits to lead America to prosperity on a permanent basis and make recessions obsolete. It was called Keynesian economics, and the 1960s were a pivotal decade in the shift from classic to Keynesian economics. Of course, this Keynesian economics was nonsense. The reality is that governments that overspend face global and epidemical forces from the outside that no amount of mystic theory can avoid or kick down into the deep freeze. When anybody proposes cradle-to-the-grave disbursements by the U.S. Treasury that somehow sound free, our misinformation becomes complete. The Academy Award-winning 2010 documentary, Inside Job, shows how the study of economics has been completely corrupted.
The financial industry also exerts its influence in a more subtle way, one that most Americans don't know about. It has corrupted the study of economics itself.
Arm-twisting pro-U.S. governments. By 1960, the world was filled with pro-U.S. states as a result of the CIA's actions. Although this was done initially simply to fight the Cold War, the ESF turned to these countries for support in defending the dollar. You see, foreign purchases of U.S. securities weren't left entirely to chance. Foreign governments were coaxed into investing in the dollar in the most statistically smoothing way. In other words, the ESF went back to all the fascists, militarists, and murderers it supported, and through some arm twisting, got them to help defend the dollar. These CIA-installed regimes started accumulating more dollars in their official reserves than they actually needed. The Treasury also began to pressure these pro-U.S. states to buy weapons, since purchases of military wares helped to defend the dollar. Take Japan, for example, who was recruited to help save the dollar in 1968. Japan agreed to aid the dollar by purchasing Treasury securities and increasing its purchases of American arms. Since then, Japan's reserves have skyrocketed, and Japan remains one of the top 10 buyers of U.S. weapons. With 70% of all sales, America now runs a global weapons monopoly. Don't think for a second that that's an accident. The IMF and World Bank seek repayment on their phony loans. The 1960s also witnessed another type of revolution, the empowerment of the World Bank and the IMF. If you remember, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund were created by the ESF to help finance covert operations. Under the cover of foreign aid, they made billions of, quote, loans to fund CIA activities. Well, in the 60s, the ESF started trying to collect on all these phony loans. This is outlined in the book Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins. The ESF used highly paid professionals who cheated countries around the world to get the loans repaid. These economic hitmen used draconian techniques to get the IMF and World Bank their money back. Their tools for getting their way were even nastier, and when these economic hitmen failed to get leaders to comply,
the jackals go in and either overthrow or assassinate these leaders, and if the jackals fail, as they did in Iraq, then they send in the military.
President Kennedy disagrees with the ESF. Although the ESF had an extraordinary amount of power, there was one person that was supposed to be able to control it, the President of the United States. And when the ESF was beginning its desperate dollar defense, the President of the United States was John F. Kennedy. Now, it was no secret that the Treasury and President Kennedy's Council of Economic Advisors had been engaged in a running battle over the best way to defend the dollar. The divisions within the American government followed habitual lines. The Treasury Department, specifically Secretary Douglas Dillon and Undersecretary Robert V. Rosa, advocated rather limited changes in international financial arrangements. It is no surprise that the Treasury resisted monetary reform. You'd expect the guy selling Rosa bonds to reject the idea of scrapping the existing system. On the other side, you had President Kennedy's Council of Economic Advisors, the State Department, and the White House staff, who wanted radical new international mechanisms and far greater multilateral currency management. That would have been the end of Bretton Woods and the ESF-controlled monetary system. For the first 2.5 years of Kennedy's presidency, the view of the Treasury prevailed. But in the middle of 1963, JFK stopped listening to the Treasury. President Kennedy swung more closely to the views held by his Council of Economic Advisors. Monetary reform was winning support. Then in August 1963, JFK came publicly to accept the idea that the United States had to join in the creation of a new international financial machinery. This was a radical change. 2 months later, in October, the President won a standing ovation for declaring that the United States will support any needed measures to increase international liquidity. Widespread support seemed to be developing for an overhaul of the world's currency system, and President Kennedy was about to expose the ESF's secrets to the world, sending important people at the Treasury to jail, the same people who, through the Secret Service, were in charge of defending his life. 1 month later, President Kennedy died, killed by a magic bullet. And when JFK's brother, Robert Kennedy, ran for president, he died. Even JFK's son also died. The Kennedy curse. There was one good thing stemming from the death of President Kennedy, and that's the fact that monetary reform died with him. Ambitious plans to remake the world's monetary system never got off the ground. This disappointed the State Department, the Council of Economic Advisors, and a large number of academic economists. And it was a triumph for Robert Rosa, the manager of the Treasury's ESF. Things spiral out of the ESF's control. Although the threat of monetary reform was gone, the ESF, in trying to defend the dollar, was essentially running a giant Ponzi scheme that was doomed to failure. The steady drop in U.S. gold defied all attempts to plug the drain, and by 1967 the United States was at the brink of a fiscal crisis. The London gold pool failed. In 1968, in the face of the largest gold rush in history, buyers throughout Europe demanded gold, and mob scenes erupted as the price soared. Many refused to accept U.S. dollars as payment. Gold stocks were cleaned out virtually overnight. The trading in gold was colossal. The rush was on because speculators had become convinced that the U.S. was nearing the end of its gold tether. Having tasted blood and scenting the kill, they ripped and clawed the remaining gold stocks from the gold pool. The whole international monetary system was collapsing, with the Treasury controlling its actions. Confidence in the Fed collapsed. The Fed became a joke. The Federal Reserve hurls thunderbolts and nothing happens. It tells the world solemnly that, by golly, it means business in stopping inflation, but it doesn't know how. The U.S. deficit spiraled out of control, and the more money these deficits created, the more severe the inflation. The law of supply and demand made this inevitable. Declining currencies accelerate as they fall, and the dollar was crashing against gold, and consumer prices were soaring parabolically. The ESF's Rosa bonds and forward transactions created losses as the dollar depreciated. The ESF soon registered a negative capital position. It was technically bankrupt. A sense of fear of the unknown was being transmitted by the normally cool operators of the New York Fed. Not only was the dollar falling against stronger currencies, but also weaker ones. There was a sense of panic. In newspapers, the Treasury was being openly ridiculed. Then, in 1979, the dollar lost its biggest support. The European community was determined to avoid further inflation, and so the Treasury was told that support from Europe was gone. The vulnerability of the dollar was impossible to describe. Congress was warned that America was about to experience a holocaust of runaway inflation, a cataclysm which would make the Depression seem like a tea party. Then deficits stopped mattering. In 1981, caught in a tide of red ink, administration officials tried, somewhat implausibly, to downplay the traditional view that deficits lead to spiraling prices. Stunned audiences were told that there is no direct or indirect connection between deficits and inflation. The U.S. then ran massive deficits, and inflation went down. The link between deficits and inflation broke completely. For the record, this is the equivalent of an African shaman declaring he has mystical powers and then levitating himself in a ring of fire. After deficits stopped mattering, the dollar soared, and the ESF's profits skyrocketed. In 1980, after dumping 100,000 tons of gold onto the market in a desperate attempt to keep prices down, the Treasury halted regular gold sales. Gold prices then entered a 20-year bear market. Remember the variety of stratagems the ESF used to arm itself with foreign currencies by borrowing from abroad? Well, after 1980, this stopped being a problem. The all-knowing, all-seeing Fed did what it had to do to kill inflation without ever stopping printing money. We were spending our way to prosperity, enjoying the best economy in years, low unemployment, high profits, trivial inflation, all fueled by our willingness to go deeply into debt in the cause of immediate gratification. It was called disinflation, and it was here to stay. Sure, the majority of financial experts had been expecting a wave of inflation, a rerun of the 1970s, only worse. But things didn't work out that way, thanks to the magic of disinflation. As for questions like, why did interest rates enter a 30-year downward trend? Or, how the hell does this disinflation thing work? Well, they remain unanswered.
All parts are available in the show summary, and the videos will have some supporting diagrams and images, and these may help those who do not have English as a first language to follow the history a little better. In disclosure-related news for the week, the global movement to continue the final push to acknowledge the existence of our galactic families is continuing. Although still not acknowledged on a globally public level, those knowing where to look for information are finding that there is a large body of people worldwide who already know and accept this truth, and they already know the lies that are being shared relating to the cover-up of this truth. Since 2001, when the U.S. Defense Department could not account for the loss of over $2 trillion the day before 9/11 happened, to all the money that has been lost and unaccounted for since then, amounting to well over $8 trillion, one has to wonder where this money has gone, and one must also therefore wonder to whom the world is in debt to, if the countries of the world are bankrupt. Reports are surfacing of secret black budget space programs, and it is alleged that vast resources have been funneled into these programs, as well as into deep underground cities, military bases, and futuristic transportation systems worldwide. It is no longer a conspiracy theory when those theories can be backed up with credible and qualifiable witnesses from numerous branches of military worldwide, as well as intelligence officials, civilian contracted companies, air traffic controllers, law enforcement officials, and more. Former head of the Clinton election campaign, John Podesta, has publicly sent out messages stating not only his interest in the issue relating to ETs, but also his desire to seek out information while he had connections to the White House, something that he claimed he was unable to do. Hillary Clinton has openly made loose references to wanting to get to the bottom of the ET issue at Roswell without going into details about her connection to what is being called the Rockefeller Initiative, as proposed by Paradigm Research founder Stephen Bassett. Bassett has himself sponsored a citizen congressional hearing that has established beyond reasonable doubt the existence of civilizations and technologies of a non-Earth origin, and that there has been a deliberate truth embargo established to protect this information from being made known. Before humanity can fully begin its shift into a higher vibrational state of existence and being, there is much that humanity must shake loose from the current, more dense vibrational energies. This is what we are currently witnessing worldwide. Much is being revealed on numerous levels. Those who are wise and compassionate enough willingly choose to just observe and not engage the denser energies, while others choose to drop into fear and hate-mongering rhetoric, bringing up all their repressed dramas to be fully exposed and therefore given an opportunity to be released and healed if one is willing to choose this, which, so far, many have not, given how they so eagerly spew out their comments on various issues, from Trump to Russia to the environment to this to that, to racial division, police brutality, and so on. For those people, it is needing to be exposed. For others, they may have already acknowledged it and are eagerly wanting to move forward. Thus, we are beginning to witness groups of people being drawn to form communities that are based in higher vibrations, so they can exist and share together while building the new paradigm that renders the old one obsolete, while others are happy to complain and play the role of willing victims to support their current worldview. Humanity is being impacted in many subtle ways, and one of which is resulting from increased activity coming from the sun, with geomagnetic storms that are registering a higher exposure to certain frequencies from the sun. Recently, there have been more than a few reports, but most recently on December 6th in Norway and December 11th in Spain, of exploding fireballs racing across the sky. RT reported on the event in Spain and included videos. Videos are also apparently available of the Norwegian event, although this one took place further out onto the water. Rumors associated with David Wilcock and some of his sources have speculated that these fireballs may actually be the destruction of some of the ships relating to the deep space programs that are connected to negative groups attempting to play out the corporate global cabal agenda. Reports of strange sounds are also beginning to surface around the world, including Ireland and the southern U.S. The sounds could be anything from a sudden boom to a longer, more drawn-out noise that no one can locate or identify. David Wilcock has been associated with sources that he believes have connections to information relating to the various secret space programs I mentioned moments ago. It has been getting a bit challenging because the sources connected to David Wilcock appear to be at least a little bit in contradiction to the opinions and feelings of Dr. Stephen Greer. Greer was the founder of the Disclosure Project, and back in 2001, 6 months before 9/11, he brought together credible people willing to state their knowledge of and involvement in projects relating to ETs and to suppressed technologies. I am trying to stay the observer between information coming out from Wilcock's sources and the information being shared by Greer. In the last few months, Greer has released a new documentary project, however, as a follow-up to his previous documentary called Serious Disclosure, a play on words relating to the star Sirius. The following is the trailer for his new documentary, Unacknowledged, an exposé.
How do you keep something secret? You hide it in plain sight.
There were bodies that were involved with some of these crashes, also some were alive.
I said, well, you got to tell the public about it. And he says, no, we don't tell the public about this. It would panic the public.
And you know, there's a new name. It's unexplained aerial phenomenon.
I'm a doctor in an ER taking care of shootings and stabbings and car wrecks. And I'm being asked to brief the CIA director on stuff because he and the president are being lied to. What?
And he said, by the way, we've discovered a base on the backside of the moon. And I said, whose?
If the average person knew that the term UFO was actually concocted after they knew that they were extraterrestrial vehicles or man-made anti-gravity devices, they would realize that for 60 years we've already had the solution to the environmental crisis, the energy crisis, and global poverty. The most dangerous thing going on the planet today isn't ISIS. It's not Iraq. It's not Russia. It's not China. It's a out-of-control, covert group that is not being overseen by the people, the Congress, or the president, who have developed these technologies and are recklessly using them to track and target extraterrestrial vehicles. The result of this is that we're in a crisis that is unacknowledged, ironically, because these projects are unacknowledged.
I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world.
There is no threat, and we have to prevent the weaponization of space.
So either they don't exist, but if they are, they're a threat. So this is the 1-2 punch that's been going on, unfortunately, for 60-some years. He said, do you know why they killed Marilyn?
Mr. President, the late Marilyn Monroe.
And I said, well, I didn't until I got this document. It's a virtual death warrant.
When they found out that Tesla had passed away, they came in, they had the manager of the hotel open the safe, and they took all of Tesla's papers.
Now, a lot of people say, oh, well, that's an urban myth or a conspiracy theory. I say, like the hell it is. This is like a bad, conspiracy novel, except this became my life.
With all political circles in the U.S. in confusion and disarray resulting from the election, rumors are circulating that the global cabal may be attempting to conjure up some kind of announcement that may bring a new level of distraction to the world, possibly to prevent Trump from being sworn in as the next U.S. president. Some of these rumors include crashing the financial system, but also a rumor persists about introducing a so-called discovery from Antarctica. An increasing number of high-profile people have suddenly been making visits to Antarctica. We've been taught that there is very little in that part of the world except for several scientific outposts doing measurements there. It seems that perhaps they have been doing much more. Sources have been reporting that there is an entrance to inner Earth located there, just as there is also an entrance over the northern pole of the planet, and this is allegedly why civilian aircraft are not allowed to fly there, the excuse being that the magnetic pole will mess with civilian air instruments, but strangely do not seem to affect military instruments. There are reports of large pieces of ice breaking off down in Antarctica, as well as reports of massive flooding in underground lakes and rivers. This is being tied into the fear-mongered message and possible global hoax relating to global warming. Yet, people continue to go there. Pope Francis's counterpart in Russia, Patriarch Kirill, has gone there, and Joseph P. Farrell, in an article appearing on the Millennium Report website on December 14th, reported that, adding it all up, we have the following increasingly strange and bizarre list of people that have either visited or have been connected to Antarctica. He mentions Rudolf Hess, sponsor of the 1938-39 Nazi expedition, Hermann Goering, sponsor of the Nazi expedition, Admiral Richard Byrd, visitor and leader of Operation High Jump in 1947, who makes strange remarks for El Mercurio of Santiago de Chile about the USA preparing to defend against enemy fighters that can fly from pole to pole with tremendous speed, presumably in reference to the alleged anti-gravitational transportation technology that Nazi Germany was rumored to be in possession of. Russian Orthodox Patriarch of Moscow, Kirill III, a visitor to bless, so-called, an Orthodox chapel. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry recently went down just before the election to learn about so-called climate change. Buzz Aldrin, the Apollo 11 moon astronaut, has been there. Prince Harry of Great Britain has been down there. And King Juan Carlos of Spain has also spent time down there. There were also alleged reports of the Russian Navy escorting Saudi Arabia's mysterious Ark of Gabriel to Antarctica in December of 2015, although this has not been independently confirmed. David Wilcock has recently written a post on his blog about the Antarctic Atlantis and ancient ET ruins located there. 2 London tabloid newspapers appear to be running with the story. As mentioned earlier, the global warming theories may be starting to expose that under the ice in Antarctica are remains of ancient civilizations that prove that Earth's climate was at one time a temperate climate, and this may be what our planet is now returning to, a theory that feels very possible to me personally. Scientists have already discovered from taking ice samples that there was fertile land located there at one time. Jennifer Hale of the London Sun reported on December 12th that one scientific theory claims that once upon a time Antarctica was ice-free and home to an ancient civilization. The theory, called crustal displacement, alleges that movements in the Earth's crust meant that large parts of Antarctica were ice-free 12,000 years ago and people could have lived there. Allegedly, a society could have existed prehistory, coming to an end with the last ice age which froze over the continent. This revelation, by itself, would essentially destroy all the history that has been taught to school children worldwide. Hale added that Antarctica's secret city was apparently confirmed by an ancient map called the Piri Reis map, compiled in 1513 from military intelligence. It appears to show the Antarctic coast hundreds of years before it was discovered, but was denounced by many scholars at the time. However, earlier this year, photos from NASA appeared to reveal traces of a human settlement underneath the ice. Rachel O'Donoghue, in her article for the London Daily Star, wrote on December 12th that just a month ago, further proof of an Antarctica Atlantis emerged in the form of pictures of what appears to be huge pyramids jutting out of its ice. The astounding photos showed structures that bear an uncanny resemblance to the pyramids of Giza, which were built thousands of years ago by the ancient Egyptians. Could all of this mean one of the world's greatest mysteries is about to be unlocked? Dr. Michael Salla, in an article on December 13th, described the civilization that may have been discovered as being flash frozen. For those who recall the movie The Day After Tomorrow, a scenario was presented when the ocean currents suddenly dropped, resulting in 3 huge global storms that created hurricane-like circular storms, but pulled in intensely cold air from the upper parts of Earth's atmosphere, resulting in the flash freezing of anything in the eye of the storm. The end of the movie showed most of North America in a new ice age, and it is possible that this is the same scenario that once played out in Antarctica and is now being exposed for all to see. All the links, including Wilcox's post and the article from Salla relating to the story, will be available for those eager to learn a bit more. We are moving towards something. Exactly what that is and how it will play out remains to be seen over the coming weeks. Due to the current length of the newscast at this point, I'm going to skip over the science, tech, and health news for the week and jump immediately into this week's final words. I've been going through a fair bit of reflection over the last 4.5 years over where CVN has come from and where it may be going. CVN rode a wave in 2012 when everyone was looking for information about global change, the Mayan calendar, December 21st, and so forth. At that time, many thought that something sudden on a physical level was going to magically change the world and make things easier for everyone. I knew it was not going to happen this way, although it was hard for some in the group that I was connected to at the time to accept this, but that was the way it had to be. There was, however, shifts that took place on much deeper levels than most can wholly understand at this time. I was also told that I and CVN would be fulfilling a much greater role, and perhaps my ego wanted to believe that it would happen in the time frame that was offered back then. A part of me knew inside that it would very likely not unfold exactly in that way, even though there is always a possibility that it may unfold in a different way in a future moment of now. At the time I was writing this, my shamanic friend reminded me of a quote by Eckhart Tolle. "The world is insane, and yet we are constantly looking for recognition from an insane world." If that is not the exact quote, it is something close to it. What is it that I've been looking for in this insane world? What is it that each of us is looking for in this insane manifestation now playing out? Most of us know that there are great things awaiting on the other side of these changes for those who have agreed at a higher level to be a part of the new earth at a higher vibration. There are also those souls who have finished up their roles and may be choosing to move on, and there are those who are unable to change and thus will have to leave because they are no longer able to tolerate the higher vibrations. Like one who no longer fits in with a clique at school, one might leave that clique in search of another group vibration that is more in alignment with that soul in that moment. The indigenous vision questing also involved fasting for periods of time until certain key messages were brought to the individual. During my fasting period, I was able to clean approximately 13 to 15 kilograms, or about 30 pounds, of short and long-term negative waste from my body. I was not even big before, and I still had all of this in my body, and it probably isn't even all of it. To start a new 9-year cycle, I chose to eliminate as much past baggage and negativity as possible, with as much love and compassion as possible. My fasting and cleansing period this time lasted 19 days. Strangely enough, in this longer fasting, I did not feel any of the past strong cravings for food. I managed through this part of it more easily than I thought I might. I was looking forward to having some food as a reward at the end, but during the process, there were times I didn't even take the health supplements or drink the psyllium husk bentonite clay drinks because I was not feeling for it. It was almost as if I was detached from the need to eat or consume. With the journey, however, also came the reflection of my life path. With this process, I also began to reflect more on this identity of me as some important person here to do something great. I have begun deconstructing all that I have previously thought about me, my ego-created role, my interpreting of who I think I am or what I think I am meant to be. Last week, I stated that I am neither more nor am I less than any of you sharing your valuable time with me each week. This remains true to me. If a future moment of now allows me the honor of serving in some capacity that remotely resembles what I originally thought, then perhaps I can be better prepared to honor that with greater humility, service, courage, and compassion. If not, then so be it. I have fulfilled something only because it felt meaningful to me in the moment, and hopefully it was not driven by an egoic expectation of some kind. It is almost like starting a new job, but even with a new job, one has at least an idea of what one is stepping into. For the most part, I feel unattached to any specific outcome. I observe, but am losing desire to engage in all the emotions I see people allowing themselves to be sucked into with certain current events. Being in a void can be scary. Perhaps it is a dark night of the soul. Perhaps it is a moment of ultimate surrender. For the first time recently, I looked at a map of the world, wondering where I could consider living in my next journey. I drew a complete blank. It was almost as if I really didn't care anymore. I looked at this map and I began to wonder if this is what I am a part of anymore. I didn't really fit in before, but it seems to be even more so at this point. I no longer have a sense of what my purpose is, where I am to be, what I am to do, or how I will do it, and why. As I said, a feeling of being in a complete void. The canvas is clean, the page is new, and something is just waiting to be added to it. And I have no idea what that is anymore. Some of you will recognize this and will not be alarmed by it. Others who have not yet experienced this may react with a bit of alarm with what I have just shared. Please don't. Each individual will have to pass through this phase when she or he is finally ready to do so in the appropriate moment. It seems scary. Perhaps it even is scary to a degree. If we welcome it and endeavor to embrace it, perhaps one can begin to get a sense of where one may be guided within that void. When the void suddenly disappears, a completely different something may be awaiting one that was totally unexpected, but perhaps better than anything before. Life is what happens when one is busy making other plans. The expression can be applied as much within one's personal life path as it can be to the overall global changes happening at this time. Will this make me a better journalist? I honestly don't know. Will I remain a journalist? I honestly don't know. I know something has to change in my world for me to consider growing CVN if this is what is supposed to happen. As I was writing this, sitting here currently in a hot climate for 3 more days, I'm reading the headlines of snowstorms across North America. Many are dreaming of escaping that cold climate to be in a hot climate. I look around where I am, and I am surrounded by the same rat race consumerism, commercialism, pollution, noise, and so forth, but it is warm. I actually pondered what I really wanted for myself, just me for a moment, a wish for me that does not involve the world. I found myself wishing that I could be in a beautiful log cabin in the mountains somewhere with snow falling. The cabin has a large, well-lit pine tree and decorated with very natural items, not relating to the traditional holiday season. There is a fireplace with a fire, and I am sitting with a special woman beside me in front of this fire, knowing that later there might be a horse-drawn sleigh ride. just for 10 to 14 days. Nothing else but good food, healthy drinks, nature, entertainment, companionship, quality time, and fun. Wow. I'm having a hard time even hearing myself say that word. No other worldly concerns, no religion, no commercialism, no noise, no internet, no phones, no news, and no other negative distractions. If there was ever a moment that I may feel tempted to get lost in forever, it may very well be a moment like this one. However, it is only a moment to rest and recharge before taking on the exciting changes happening at this time. We all need to detach and create a space where we can regenerate and recreate. Now that I've taken steps to clean out my physical suitcase, I can begin to look forward to bringing some new, higher vibrational and hopefully more positive, healthy energies into this physical shell to help it move forward in its service. As part of this week's Final Words, I'm going to include in the show summary a video from Eckhart Tolle. In the segment, Tolle goes into the subject of the dark night of the soul. Perhaps it may offer something meaningful for some listeners at this time. Create a wonderful week until our next moment of now. So that is a sample of the unfolding higher consciousness news around the world this week. Cosmic Vision News is broadcast weekly from the CosmicVisionNews.com website. Links to stories used in this broadcast are published in the show summary available on the website. CVN can be followed through its Facebook page, Minds page, and YouTube channel, as well as on Twitter, Google+, and LinkedIn. Thank you for sharing your time with me. I'm Jeffrey West, reminding you that if one avoids conflict to keep the peace, one starts a war within oneself. Until our next moment of now, stay grounded in love, hold the vision of light and peace in your hearts, and keep your eyes to the skies. Disclosure is unfolding all around you. Namaste.